Good evening, and on behalf of the Institute of Latin American Studies and the Center for Mexico and Central America at Columbia University, we want to welcome you to the first of the spring semester 2022 series, Cuba and Beyond. And tonight we're definitely going beyond Cuba because our topic is migrations and migrants, Cubans and Haitians in Mexico. We have an extraordinary lineup of speakers, as well as a very talented moderator, Nara Milanich from Barnard College, who is the director of the Center for Mexico and Central America, will moderate. And our speakers will be, and I'm going to mention them in the order that they will be speaking: Adam Isaacson, Nicole Phillips, Savitri Avery Arvi, and Daniela Brughi Palomino. And the topic obviously will be the extraordinary challenges that Haitians and Cubans encounter on their way to Mexico in their hopes of getting into the US. The complexities of that will be discussed by our speakers. And we would like to remind you that if you have a question, please put it in the chat room, not in the Q&A. They will be gathered up, the questions will be gathered up. If there are 3 questions on the same topic, I will summarize them for our panelists. And each panelist will have approximately 20 minutes to speak with a little bit of flexibility. And then at the end, if there are any burning issues they want to discuss amongst themselves, we will have a short period for discussion, and whatever time is remaining will be for questions and answers. This webinar will be videotaped, and it will be posted on the Cuba program webpage at Columbia University, as well as on YouTube. Give us about 2 weeks to get it edited and up there. I'll now turn it over to Nara Milanich, whom, as I mentioned previously, is the director of the Center for Mexico and Central America at the Institute for Latin American Studies at Columbia University. And she's also a professor of history at Barnard College. Nara.
Thank you so much, Meg. Welcome, everyone. It falls to me to introduce our speakers. I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak this evening. We'll begin with Adam Isaacson, Director of Defense Oversight of the Washington Office on Latin America, which monitors U.S. Cooperation with Latin America's security forces and other security trends. Isaacson is also focused on border security, has visited the US-Mexico border about 20 times, and has completed field research along the Guatemala-Mexico border. He's published extensively on US agencies' security buildup at the border. Then we'll be hearing from Nicole Phillips, who will be joining us from Haiti. She's finishing a meeting just as we speak, so she will be here momentarily. Nicole is legal director of the Haitian Bridge Alliance, which advocates for fair and humane immigration policies, and specifically works to elevate the issues unique to Black migrants and builds solidarity and collective movement toward policy change. I cannot speak this evening. Through her leadership, Haitian Bridge is engaged in several collaborative research projects to document anti-Black racism in the US and Mexican immigration systems. Next, we'll hear from Savitri Arvi, who is policy advisor in the Women's Refugee Commission's Migrant Rights and Justice Program, where she focuses on regional protection issues in Mexico and Central America and US foreign policy. Savitri has collaborated with researchers at UT Austin and UC San Diego to document shifts in US border and immigration policies and conditions and access to rights for asylum seekers waiting in Mexico. And finally, we'll hear from Daniela Brughi Palomino, who is co-director of the Latin American Working Group. She has spearheaded transnational advocacy and campaigns related to human rights in Mexico and Central America, migrant rights and border issues, and has worked on the protection of migrant rights in the US-Mexico-Central America corridor with a variety of civil society organizations and foundations for over 12 years. So even though I cannot speak this evening, I'd like to welcome you all. Thanks so much to our panelists. If you have questions as they're speaking, again, please put them in the chat and we will gather them up. And I want to thank our panelists. So I will now turn the rectangle over to Adam.
Thank you, Nara, and thank you, Meg. It's really timely and great that you guys are doing an event about Haitian and Cuban migration. It's something that doesn't get the attention that it deserves, and I think we're going to find out in the next hour or two that it really deserves a lot. In order to do this, I'm going to share my screen, and we'll always see how that goes. It usually goes well. And hit play. And so hopefully you are now looking at a big slide. Yell at me if you're not. But what I'm going to try to do here is give an overview to guide the rest of the evening. And I will go through some numbers very quickly, which is why I'm using slides, because numbers are otherwise hard to grasp. I'm going to just talk briefly about some key moments in the last few years with Haitian and Cuban migration, go through some of the bottlenecks that migrants face on their way through South America, through Mexico, up to the US border. Hopefully this will all turn into a coherent narrative because it's something that, as I said, hasn't gotten the attention it deserves because, look, this is the total number of migrants encountered by US security forces at the US-Mexico border the last few years. The thin blue line and the thin green line are the amount of those migrants that are actually Cuban and Haitian. They are sort of overshadowed by migration from Mexico, from Central America and its northern triangle, but it's also a population that is growing. This is just the last 4 months of data by country for US Customs and Border Protection and its Border Patrol component, who they have encountered by citizenship at the US-Mexico border since September. And yeah, Haiti and Cuba are consistently in the top 10, but usually in the lower 5, with the exception of September of last year, when I'm sure you're all aware of the episode or incident in Del Rio, Texas, when about 10 to 14,000 mostly Haitian migrants showed up in the course of a few days in a pretty remote part of the US-Mexico border. We all saw the pictures of Border Patrol agents wielding whips. We are maybe not all aware, but most of us are, I think, of the massive airlift of expulsions of Haitians, including many asylum seekers, that has happened since then. That has caused the number of Haitians to plummet, although there was some recovery in the December data that was just released yesterday. But still, doesn't get the attention that you'd think it deserves, mainly because a lot of other countries have had even larger flows. In Mexico, there's a similar pattern. Mexico has saw a large increase in migration from Haiti in particular in September, which then declined after the Del Rio and the expulsions activity happened. But as we'll see, Mexico also has a very large growing population of Haitian migrants in its territory right now, some of whom are settling in Mexico, others whom would like to come to the United States but are simply blocked by the Title 42 pandemic expulsions policy and the revival of Remain in Mexico. So here is just on the US side, when you zoom in, this is what migration from Haiti has looked like since October of 2019, every month. It's about a flow of about half or just over half single adults, with a large percentage of family unit members, parents with children. Unaccompanied children hardly ever. It's usually single digits each month. The same chart to scale shows arrivals of Cubans somewhat more steady, but also slowly increasing, with single adults making up usually the majority. In Mexico, Haitians arrived in large numbers, particularly in the middle of last year and during the summer, and have dropped a bit. I had citizens of Chile to this graph as green because many, as we'll see, many of people who Mexico counts as Chilean citizens are children of Haitians who moved first to Chile before emigrating north to Mexico. And we'll talk about that route in a minute. And then Mexico has had a smaller but steady and slightly growing, just like the United States, population of apprehended migrants from Cuba. Now, Haitians and Cubans apply for asylum in the United States in significant numbers. Here's the numbers for Cuba. Now, why is there a jump in 2017? 2017 is when the so-called wet foot, dry foot policy is rescinded by the outgoing Obama administration. That policy basically said if you can make it to U.S. soil and present to a U.S. immigration official, then if you are Cuban, you will almost automatically be given asylum or something like it, some sort of protected status in the United States. That went away in 2017, forcing Cubans to have to immigrate and present themselves for asylum or get captured by Border Patrol, just like a migrant from any other country. More than half the time when they do get to immigration court, Cubans' asylum petitions are accepted. The rejections are roughly half, just over half some years. And they were more frequent during the Trump administration. Haiti rejection is far more common when Haitians present in immigration court. There's a drop in sort of asylum petitions after 2010 when the Haiti earthquake allows for more. I'm not as clear on the law as I'm sure Nicole will be, but because of the humanitarian needs after that massive earthquake in Haiti, the need to apply for asylum in order to get protected status in the United States is less, and the United States takes in more. There is that goes away in 2016, and now you've seen more Haitian asylum seekers who are generally getting rejected. Haiti last year was the #1 nationality for those seeking asylum in Mexico. These are the data from Mexico's refugee agency, Comar. Honduras had been in the #1 position, but Haiti made up, when you count Haitian Chileans and maybe a handful of Haitian Brazilian children as well, made up nearly half of all asylum seekers in Mexico last year. Haitians are also the lowest acceptance rate of major nationalities requesting asylum in Mexico, with only 39% acceptance over the years. But you see that chart from Comar shows only 8,300 Haitians having had a decision handed down since 2013, whereas that previous chart showed almost 60,000 Haitians just last year. There is a large backlog of undecided Haitian asylum requests in Mexico. Mexico used to hand down an asylum decision in 45 working days. That fell apart between just increased demand and the pandemic. And now it takes months or years, just like in the United States. And those awaiting asylum decisions are stuck in Mexico. So let me just go over some key moments. After the 2010 earthquake, in the years following that, Brazil in particular was booming. They had the World Cup, they had the Olympics, they had enormous needs for construction, and they took in a lot of Haitian. Also, Brazil was the predominant country in the peacekeeping force in Haiti, the UN peacekeeping force at the time. And they took in a lot of Haitians who came to work in those sectors. After the World Cup and the Olympics, and after Brazil's economy sort of plummeted around the time that Dilma Rousseff was impeached, many of those Haitians who were in Brazil moved to Chile and found employment there, and Chile took them in. We're talking, somebody else on the panel may have a better number, but we're talking north of 300,000 people from Haiti in those two countries combined. The pandemic caused economic declines and made employment harder to obtain in Brazil and then in Chile. And really the Piñera government in Chile took on a more anti-migrant stance, making it harder to keep work permits and legal status. And many Haitians began to leave after the pandemic, starting in 2020, 2021, taking an overland route, which we'll discuss in a bit, up through Colombia, and then up through the Central America, ending up in Mexico. Now, there was a small wave of Haitians who left Brazil in particular in the middle of 2016, making it all the way mostly to Tijuana and Mexicali. The United States had been, the Obama administration had been offering a humanitarian what do they call that? Relief to Haitians who had arrived at the border. There was an election campaign going on. The numbers were rising, and that humanitarian relief was revoked in September of 2016. And CBP, Customs and Border Protection, started doing something at the ports of entry in the San Diego sector that it had never done border-wide before, which was putting agents on the line, making sure that nobody stepped across the land border onto US soil, which would have given them the right to ask for asylum, basically checking everybody's IDs before they set foot on US soil and could no longer present easily. This was the beginning of the metering practice that became border-wide in 2018 during the Trump administration, and that caused some of the first wait lists to appear on the Mexican side of the border. And my co-panelist, Savitri Arvi, has co-authored many really helpful reports on the extent of these wait lists. So I'll let her talk about that. The Haitians who have, I should mention, in latter years, since the pandemic, there has been a policy, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, and started by the Trump administration, continued by the Biden administration, of expelling as many migrants as possible, sending them back to their country without the opportunity to ask for asylum, with the pandemic being the pretext for this. Now, sending someone back to Haiti is not simple because you would need an aircraft. But despite that, fully 23% of Haitian migrants encountered, including a large number of those after the Del Rio episode, have been expelled under Title 42. No chance to ask for protection inside the United States. Now, starting with a judicial decision in Texas in August, the Biden administration has been forced to abandon its effort to undo the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy, which had sent 71,000 people across the border into Mexico to await their hearing dates for asylum cases inside Mexico. The Biden administration was dismantling that program, but Judge Matthew Kaczmarek in Amarillo, Texas, said it had to be reinstated. The Supreme Court refused to block that requirement, and it has been restarted. But the Biden administration isn't just reluctantly dragging its feet in the reinstatement of Remain in Mexico. They have actually expanded the universe of countries to which it will be applied. And now countries are citizens of countries from all over the hemisphere, regardless of the language they speak, will have Remain in Mexico applied to them. It was never used on Haitians before. Now it is at least possible for it to be used for Haitians to be forced to remain in Mexico as well. Hasn't happened yet, but it may just be a matter of time. Just some past moments in Cuban migration. This chart from the Migration Policy Institute pretty much lays it out. You had waves like the Mariel boat lift in 1980, the Balsero crisis during Bill Clinton's first term, the years of the wet foot, dry foot policy, and then the end of that. The Cuban migration has been lower, but there have been periodic increases, but it's been much more steady. Title 42 has also been applied to Cubans. It's been applied to Cubans about 18% of the time, although not very often since April or May. And when I say applied to Cubans, they weren't sending expulsion flights to Havana. CBP was largely just sending Cubans back into Mexico because they probably had some sort of migratory status inside Mexico. But that has mostly stopped, and most Cubans are avoiding expulsion right now. How are Cubans getting there? I mean, there's often been sort of a third country or a different way of getting across Mexico. It's very hard to cross the Florida Straits on a raft. There have been go-fast boats that tend to go to Mexico. That's been a constant, but often a vector has been to go to a country that doesn't require visas. Guyana has been one of those countries. For a time, Ecuador was one of those countries. So Cuba in, I believe it was October of 2017, stopped requiring exit visas for those who wanted to leave the country. So it became possible to buy a plane ticket and go to a country if that country would take you. Ecuador is no longer, they are now requiring visas of Cubans. So that route is not being used as much. In early December, maybe it was late November, Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega's government decided to stop requiring visas for Cubans. So a lot of analysts are saying that it's likely that we're going to see an increase in flights from Havana to Managua, and then people crossing Central America and Mexico, trying to make it to the US border. But both Cubans and Haitians were making this trip through South America, going up the Pacific coast. That's really the Pan-American highway till it ends, and then taking through the Darien Gap, which I'll talk about in a minute. When the Trump administration version of Remain in Mexico was operational, Cuba was the #3 country to which it was applied. A large number of Cuban migrants were forced to remain in Mexico. There, they were often vulnerable. I mean, all migrants forced to remain in Mexico were vulnerable in Mexican border towns with high violent crime rates, high rates of assault, kidnappings, extortion, corruption that feeds all of that. The folks at Human Rights Watch, Human Rights First, the folks at Human Rights First documented more than 1,500 cases of people forced to remain in Mexico who did suffer some sort of violent attack. Cubans were particularly vulnerable in some cities because smugglers believed that they were more likely to have relatives who are more established inside the United States, more middle class, more having some means. Anecdotally, other migrants from Central America would say, oh, well, you can tell the Cubans because they wear nicer clothes. They clearly are getting more money from their relatives, but that made them more vulnerable to would-be extortionists or kidnappers who in Mexican border towns. Once again, this is also happening once again, but there were so many Cubans bottled up in places like Ciudad Juarez in particular, to a lesser extent, Nuevo Laredo, to some extent Tijuana, that in downtown Juarez, just about 10 blocks from the port of entry, there were a couple of Cuban restaurants where you could get ropa vieja, and all of the staff were people waiting for their court dates in the Remain in Mexico program. With the restart of Remain in Mexico, Cuba is the #3 country to which it is being applied under the Biden administration. Remarkably, the #1, 2, and 3 countries so far are countries whose human rights record the Biden administration and the Trump administration criticizes most forcefully, despite the fact that they would have very strong cases for asylum. They are being made to wait in Mexico. Now, both Cubans and Haitians, but particularly in recent months, Haitians, as they make this trip up the Pan American Highway, this is the map made by Colombia's National Roads Institute in Villas. That town, Necoclí, is as close as you can get to Panama. The Pan American Highway has always had a gap in pretty much everything between the Panama Canal and the Colombian border is very dense jungle called the Darien Gap. It is a place that is ungoverned, it is treacherous. Migrants for years have said that it is the scariest place to go on the entire journey through South America, all the way up through Central America, where they see dead people. They hear about people, or maybe somebody in their group has even been drowned. The chance of being robbed is enormous. The chance of being raped is remarkably enormous. Doctors Without Borders came out with some really terrifying data on that last year. Necoclí, this town on the Caribbean coast, is where the road pretty much ends, and people have to take a ferry across the Gulf of Urabá there to get to Panama. The ferries can only take so many people, and by this fall, 10 to 15,000 people were waiting just on the beach, mostly Haitian, but not entirely, in Necoclí, just waiting as much as a month for their turn to go on one of the ferries across Panama, but then taking their way across the Darien Gap. The Darien Gap had usually never seen maybe more than 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people a year trying to make this journey. Last year, it exceeded 100,000 people making this journey, the majority of them from Haiti. Mainly this flow from Brazil and Chile going up the continent. Another bottleneck, once people do manage to get through the Darien Gap, out of the encampment that Panama makes through Central America, they enter, most of them enter Mexico in the town of Tapachula, Chiapas, just over the border from Guatemala. And there, Mexico has been very effective at stopping their further progress with roadblocks, with stopping any efforts at caravans. And of course, if you're Haitian and you have brown skin, you stand out quite a bit. So the Mexican forces find you quite easily. With no chance of getting across Mexico, more and more, and really Mexico unable to say, expel that many Haitians, Haitians in large numbers have been filing those applications for asylum, which are backlogged. They wait under Mexico's policies, which are now changing barely. Those who apply for asylum are forced to wait in the state where they applied in Mexico for that decision. That has been for the vast majority Chiapas, a state that is Mexico's poorest. Tapachula, a city of just over 300,000 people, had more than 85,000 people apply for asylum in 2021, and very few of them have had decisions handed down yet. At one point, though, well, I should just say, there was a point in September after a failed caravan attempt when, again, about 15,000, mostly Haitian migrants, somehow got out of Chiapas and made their way to the US-Mexico border and ended up in Del Rio, and you saw what happened then. Haitians have tended to arrive in parts of the border that are more remote. Yuma and Del Rio in particular are very unpopulated parts of the border. The border towns across are also quite small in Mexico. One theory is that well, obviously that's the way the smuggling routes go, but another theory is that these are areas where organized crimes control is not as strong on the Mexican side. So there's not it's not as dangerous and there's not as much of a toll to pay. But it's remarkable. As recently as 2020, more than half of Haitian migrants were showing up in Tijuana and San Diego. That went down to 1% so far this year, this fiscal year, whereas Yuma and Del Rio and increasingly El Paso are where more Haitians are showing up. But yeah, again, I should have showed this Del Rio slide before, but yeah, this episode drew national attention to this sudden arrival of Haitian migrants at the US-Mexico border, which has since been followed. Here's Tom Cartwright on Twitter, who tracks this every day. He has tracked now 151 flights to Port-au-Prince since the Del Rio incident. This tweet is from this morning. More than 16,000 Haitians systematically sent back to Cuba without the chance to seek asylum, often in shackles. Since the Biden administration started a year ago, more than 19,000 Haitians sent back. There's about 12 million people or maybe 13 million in Haiti. So more than, it's about 1 in every 600 something people in Haiti right now was expelled by air from the United States in the last 12 months, which is really stunning when you think about it. Cubans are arriving also in pretty remote areas, also Yuma and Del Rio. They used to arrive in larger numbers in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, but that has mostly stopped. So where are we headed in 2022? And I will sign off here after talking for a long time. Obviously, between climate change and COVID and large increasing crime rates, the power of gangs in Haiti, we can probably expect more migration this year. Especially given, economic collapse, turmoil. I am trying to stop sharing my screen. There it is. But we're going to see increasing use of, or continuing use of Title 42, increasing use of the Remain in Mexico program, which will mean larger numbers of people bottled up in Mexico, even more than in the United States. You're going to see, we've already seen Haitian neighborhoods pop up in Tijuana. In Tapachula, there's a few hundred Haitians that have arrived just in the last month or so. In Ciudad Juarez now, it's going to really tax the abilities of shelters, of humanitarian organizations, and it's really not clear that either the U.S. or Mexican governments are on top of this. And I look forward to hearing what others say about that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Adam, and welcome, Nicole. We're so glad that you could join us despite your busy schedule. Take it away, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Nada. And thank you, Adam. I caught most of your presentation, I believe, and I think you're making my job easier. That was just such a wonderful overview with a lot of facts and statistics of slides that I think all of us wish we could produce. So thank you for producing that. So I'm in Port-au-Prince right now. And it's interesting because we spend a lot of time. I'm the legal director at Haitian Bridge Alliance. Nara mentioned that our bios are just put in the chat. But to cut to the chase, I'm a legal director of this organization called Haitian Bridge Alliance, and we are a sort of the only Black-led organization that works on the U.S.-Mexico border. Most of us speak Haitian Creole. And are not myself, but I speak Haitian Creole, and the rest of us are immigrants, mostly from, or have immigrant families from Haiti, the Caribbean, or Africa. And so we spend a lot of our time talking about Haitians fleeing Haiti. And and other countries too, right? Whether it's Cameroon or Cuba or various different countries who talk about fleeing. And I testify as an expert witness in immigration cases, asylum cases, about why it is so dangerous and why said individual might be harmed or even worse, murdered if they were to return to Haiti. And now that I'm in Haiti again, and I used to live here for about 8 years, from 2010 to 2018. Now I'm here, I feel an obligation to say, yes, there are very good reasons why so many people are forced to flee. And I also want to remind us that this is an incredibly beautiful country and that there is a lot here as well. And I'm saying this for myself because I feel like I'm so negative all the time in trying to protect our clients. And so having said that, there is a lot of the US government has certainly handled Haitian immigrants poorly, and as Adam has mentioned, through policies like Title 42, the metering policy that went into effect 2015, the Title 42 that went into effect in 2020. The US government has not handled Haitian immigrants well at all and has actually bypassed its domestic as well as international legal obligations to provide access to asylum or some other type of protection under asylum laws, but under the Convention Against Torture as well. And the US government has not been doing that. This is not something that was new to President Trump. He got a lot of the blame about it. We immigration advocates sort of spoke up more loudly when it was President Trump doing this. But this really started under the Obama administration in 2016, as Adam described, under the metering policy, where they changed the old age policy of dry foot, wet foot, where people could apply for asylum if they came by foot on land, just not by boat. And so they made people wait in Mexico and take a number to be able to file for asylum, as if they're waiting in line for ice cream. And so that was the metering policy that has now been, we've got an order from a district court in Southern California and Pasadena saying that that order was illegal, which is great. We'll build on it. This is something where the lawyers have been working tirelessly for the last couple of years, challenging all of these discriminatory policies, because many of them have anti-Black racism in sort of involved in why these policies. We don't want Haitian, right? US government has traditionally not ever wanted Haitian migrants to come onto US soil. And in fact, if you look back into policies starting in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, when Haitians were fleeing the Duvalier dictatorship, which was a dictatorship that started in the early 1960s and went through to or even late, actually 1950s, and went through to 1986 or so. In that time, there were, as we can recall, lots of people fleeing on boats, trying to flee this dictatorship that was largely economically and politically supported by various US presidents over the year. So the Duvalier dictatorship would not have existed were it not for US support financially and politically. At the UN, et cetera. And so on the one hand, the US government was giving money to one of the worst dictatorships in the Western Hemisphere in the 20th century, which is saying a lot because we all know there's been some pretty bad dictators. And on the other hand, putting up any kind of front, making sure that their asylum seekers, the people fleeing, the refugees, could not legally come onto US soil. And so that's when we heard about Guantanamo was established, not for 9/11. Guantanamo was established for Haitians, so that Black bodies could not come onto US soil. That is where we put people. I say we, the US government. And so they were kept there. They also were in 1981 under President Reagan is when the whole prison system, the detention centers, immigration detention center system as we know it was established. And that again was in response to Haitians so that we could lock up Black bodies, criminalize Black bodies who are trying to seek asylum in the United States. So we can see that this infrastructure of immigration policy really is not new. Obama was certainly not the first person to do it, but it's really the continuation of a long legacy of the United States keeping Haitians off of US soil. And then Adam mentioned Del Rio, that happened in September of 2021 last year. I'm so glad you put up that photo of the man being whipped. I mean, that not only humiliated Haitian migrants who were forced to be under the bridge in Del Rio, it humiliated a lot of African Americans and Black immigrants on US soil. I mean, that was just devastating to see, and really harked back as you showed that juxtaposition of the photo that reminds us of slave catchers and others who brutalized Black bodies back 250 years ago. Is that not what our government continues to do with Black bodies? Given the vulnerability and the desperation of Black migrants who were under the bridge in Del Rio Haitians, I think the comparison is actually quite similar. I will say the good news, if there is any good news at all, is that gentleman who was seen being whipped in the photo. His name is Murad, and he lives in Haiti, was deported back to Haiti, and he is a plaintiff in a lawsuit that we filed on December 20th of last year. And it's a class action lawsuit against the Biden administration, alleging violation of the Constitution of Article number 5, sorry, Fifth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, I'm thinking in French, which is equal protection, right? And also due process, substantive due process, as well as the Administrative Procedures Act. But essentially what we're alleging is the whole policy to prevent Haitians from coming into the US and to deport them, and many of them were deported, had an anti-Black racism animus, and was part of the reason for doing that. One thing is that people don't really know what happened to those that were under Del Rio. So there were an estimated several thousand who were deported. Those came up in the statistics that Adam showed, that Tom Cartwright is maintaining regularly. Also, there were approximately about 8,000 who fled the Del Rio area, went back into Mexico because they didn't want to be deported, or because they were under the bridge. Many of them needed medical help. Many of them had suffered food. We talked to lots of folks who were under the bridge in Del Rio. They were not given adequate food or water or access to medical care. We heard some pretty terrible stories. I think what was most touching to us listening and speaking to those individuals is how they were treated when they put them into detention and then drove them to the airport to be deported. They didn't tell people where they were going. They told them, they lied to everybody we talked to. It's as if that was an administrative order. Everybody we talked to, they were lied about where they were going to. Nobody told them that they were going to be deported. And then it was only when they got to the airport that they realized they were being deported. People started yelling and shouting that they were afraid to go back to Haiti, that they hadn't been able to apply for asylum, that they couldn't go back. They were afraid something was going to happen to them. And there were people that were beaten on the bus. There were people that were beaten on the tarmac. People were stripped of their clothes. So there was just a lot of really terrible treatment that our government is doing to these. And so people were arriving without shoes, without pants, traumatized by their experience, and often many of them needing medical attention. This continues on to today, where a plane that arrived in Haiti last week had 79 individuals, almost all of them tested positive for COVID. But does the US government care about Haitians who right now there isn't an uptick in cases in COVID for the most part. Do they care about them? No. Do they care about the migrants who are getting COVID, whether they have access to medical care when they arrive in Haiti? No. So this is something they clearly don't care about their lives. And then there were several thousand who got into the United States, but it's important to say that they didn't really succeed, because they're at least legally allowed to apply for asylum in the US. None of them were given legal status. None of them were given work permits. All of them are going to have to apply for asylum. And if they win, which as Adam demonstrated, the rates are very low for winning asylum in the United States if you're Haitian, because of anti-Black bias by asylum seekers, by immigration judges throughout the whole system. Only then can you stay in the United States. Otherwise, you are going to be deported. I think I'll finish with saying this is a problem where, as Adam described, the anti-Black racism and the anti-Haitian discrimination against migrants is not just in the United States. It starts off when they migrate to Chile or Brazil. It follows them all through traveling up to the Mexico-US border, and especially through Panama. We've heard lots of stories of sexual assault, gang rapes, of girls, particularly adolescent girls between the ages of 12 and young women at 24 is who seems to be targeted the most. And they will be gang rapes in front of family members who are there. The Panamanian government does not appear to be taking this as seriously as they need to be. And so a lot of effort needs to be targeted there. But the Inter-American Commission came out with a resolution in October, I believe it was October or November of last year. And it was really great for folks wanting to work on this issue who have ties to any of the governments that we've mentioned. We really do need a lot of advocacy. For example, for anybody who wants to do shadow reports for UN treaty body reviews, if you know what that means, if you don't, let me know. We can talk about it, but there's a lot of advocacy work that can happen for each of these governments. And the Inter-American Commission resolution talks about how all of the Americas, this isn't just a US problem, but we know the US is the driver, as I'm sure Daniela is going to talk about. The US is a driver on a lot of the policies throughout the Americas, because we're the big El Norte, but at the same time, all of the countries need to come together and not see Haitians as the enemy, but instead figure out how we can change and amend our asylum policies to welcome them, to give them what they need, understanding that the Haitian government right now, there effectively is no Haitian government. Haiti is in a state of about Somalia right now in terms of the lack of a government. And I can tell you, being here, everybody is afraid to leave their home, whether you're rich or poor. Nobody wants to leave their home right now, and there is just a lot of widespread fear and violence. And so the Americas, we need to come together and welcome Haitians with dignity, instead of repelling them. We can't on the one hand say, what can we do to help Haiti after the earthquake? What can we do? What can we do? We're here with you, Haiti. We're in solidarity, but then we're going to close the door and humiliate you if you try and come into our country. And we are going to then deport you, often without your clothes on and after having beaten you, and we're going to traumatize you. And then we're going to just drop you off in your country, even though you've stated a credible fear of returning. And we're violating international and domestic law in doing so. And these are some of the policies that need to be changed. And it really, the whole Americas need to come together. And I highly recommend reading the document from the Inter-American Commission. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Savitri.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nara. And thanks, Adam and Nicole, I think, for starting off with that overview, and then Nicole with that very powerful presentation about the impacts of US policy on Haitians. It's just very, very terrible that we're a year into the Biden administration and we're just still seeing these policies and terrible impacts. And I'm just very happy to be here and have this very important conversation. So thanks again to Columbia for organizing this. Today, I'm going to discuss the conditions for Haitian and Cuban asylum seekers who are forced to wait in Mexico, both due to US restrictive policies such as Title 42 and remain in Mexico, as has already been mentioned, but also because of increased Mexican enforcement in the country. And so before I dive into talk a little bit more about that, to give you a sense, I work at Women's Refugee Commission and the Migrant Rights and Justice program, and our advocacy is pushing for the Biden administration with Congress to restore US asylum protections and modernize the immigration system to ensure fair and effective laws and processes for asylum seekers. And our advocacy has really also focused on the Mexican government and also the region, because a lot of this, as Nicole mentioned, has to do with more regional engagement. And our team carries out regular monitoring trips to Mexico and to the US-Mexico border specifically to document the conditions for individuals seeking protection. In the past few months, I've been to Mexico 3 times. In October, I was able to visit shelters in Mexico City to get a sense of the situation there. And then in December, I was in Tijuana, and just now I was in Monterrey, Mexico, kind of on the other more Texas side of the border. And so I'll be sharing some of what I saw on the ground there and the conditions that Cubans and Haitians are facing there because of those policies. But first of all, I do want to go a little bit back to the context that's creating those conditions. As Adam mentioned, again, we have the Title 42 policy. And to be very clear, that means that no asylum seeker can walk up to an official border crossing and request protection and are forced to cross between ports of entry. And so I think over and over frustration is like the misconception right now that individuals are crossing irregularly, but there is no way right now to show up to the border and request asylum at a port of entry. And I think going back to the Biden administration, a lot of us were very excited at the beginning that the Biden administration announced a lot of reparative justice and like several reparative justice initiatives, including an effort to wind down the migrant protection protocols or remain in Mexico that sent, as Adam said, 71,000 people back to Mexico to enforce them to wait there for their US immigration hearing. But as also has been brought up, there was another metering policy in place that forced thousands upon thousands of individuals, including many, many Haitians, to wait in Mexico on wait lists. And there was no kind of effort to create a process to allow those on those wait lists waiting for years across the border into the United States. And I think while there was kind of like that initial positive step, over the past number of months, we've actually seen, again, like the Biden administration doubled down kind of on a lot of these Trump era policies. And that has to do with the continuation of Title 42, but also these expulsion flights that we've seen, not only to Haiti, which has been really concerning, but also to southern Mexico. We've seen flights starting in August of asylum seekers and others sent to southern Mexico, where they have been forced by Mexican authorities across the border. And those flights have mainly been of Central Americans, but we have heard of some reports of Haitians and others being included on these flights. And I think another concern has just been like the differing impact on different nationalities by these different policies. And so the situation at the border is very confusing for different asylum seekers that sign up that show up at the border, because some are affected differently as Haitians are flown directly back to Haiti, but other asylum seekers are not subjected to the other policy. And this creates a lot of like deep confusion and a sense of frustration at the border. And so before I dive into a lot of the conditions that we recorded during our different trips, I do also want to mention kind of this context of Mexican enforcement. We've seen over the past year in a lot of regional negotiations, the Biden administration has encouraged or reportedly pressured the Mexican government to step up enforcement efforts. And in 2021, actually, Mexico saw a record number of apprehensions, over 220,000 apprehensions throughout the country. And I think most concerningly about that is we've seen since 2019, actually, but also through this year, an increasing use of Mexico's National Guard and security forces. And according to information revealed through a transparency request, 82% of apprehensions in Mexico by Mexican authorities included the Mexican Guard and security forces. And that is just very concerning, especially for Haitian and Cuban asylum seekers who have also, as Adam has previously, I think, alluded to, received a lot of targeting by Mexican authorities and asylum seekers in the country also have no really safe way to travel at the moment. Mexico last year also created new travel regulations requiring immigration status for anyone purchasing a bus ticket. And this especially leads to discrimination and racial profiling, including of Mexicans, including of Afro-descendant and indigenous Mexicans. And so these two, I think, factors in general, both the enforcement and increased travel restrictions, have led to an impossible situation where individuals are either forced to turn to smugglers, are forced to travel in caravans for safety because that's the only way that they're able to move for the country. But then very disturbingly last August, there was a peaceful caravan that left southern Mexico attempting to travel to the northern border. And we saw very disturbing images of Mexican authorities brutally beating a Haitian man and his family, and kind of pushing very violently against some women, and even separating one or two families. And so this is all to say that even before individuals arrive at the border, they're already being pushed into increasingly vulnerable situations throughout the country. And the US border, because of this enforcement, is just being pushed further and further south, further into the hands of Mexico. And it's been very concerning to see. But I think in addition to this, because of these policies and the current situation in Mexico, as we know, as Adam mentioned, a huge population has been stuck at Mexico's border. They're not able to cross and request protection, or they're being returned to Mexico either very rapidly through Title 42, or they're being returned, in the case of Haitians and Cubans, through Remain in Mexico. Now, we've already seen a few hundred to Mexico's northern border, where they're forced to wait for months and years on end. And so we traveled, as I mentioned, and wanted to see the current situation at the border, especially given the announcement of Remain in Mexico, and to see if there had been kind of coordination on the ground also with local groups, and if border cities were ready to receive a population that will likely be waiting many, many months for their court cases. I think what we saw, first of all, is that there is very limited shelter space in border cities at the moment. Shelter space had already been limited because of COVID. They're already operating at a lower capacity in some cases. But because of these policies, a number of populations are forced to wait for months and months on end in the shelter space and, aren't just there for a few days. And so there really is not that much room in shelters at the moment. And in some cities, I just spoke yesterday with a shelter director in Piedras Negras, and she said the shelters are actually closed there still because of COVID, and migrants are continuing to sleep on the street. And she's very worried right now because it's rainy season. There was a cold front in northern Mexico. And there's just kind of no sign of when this situation will change. And especially with these policies, as more and people get sent back, it will put more strain on the shelters. Right now, we know there are 2 migrant encampments at the border, kind of informal tent encampments with very poor conditions. Those encampments are in Tijuana and also Reynosa. The numbers had been around 2,000 a number of months ago. They have weaned down to a few hundred in each of those 2 encampments, but the conditions are very bad, especially I think in the case of Tijuana, Haitian migrants, and Nicole could probably talk more about this, but had received discrimination there from even other asylum seekers at the encampment, and just a very difficult security situation there. And the lack of shelter capacity, I think, often makes a lot of people look for their own accommodations. And I just heard a devastating story in December of a woman who was trying to look for a shelter space after being expelled by US Border Patrol agents, could not find any space in Tijuana shelters, and so just found a house where she could stay. But while she was staying at that house, her 20-month baby was attacked by a rabid dog and killed. And so the risks, I think, of the lack of shelter space and the lack of accommodations are real and push people to have to live in very serious situations where their lives could at times be at risk. I think when individuals, Haitians and others try to rent in Tijuana and other cities at the border, they often face a lot of discrimination, landlords taking advantage because they're not, depending on their immigration status, but not giving them rental agreements, or also just charging extra, ending those rental agreements early. I've heard that from many people I have spoken to. And we haven't really seen that the US and Mexican governments are planning to significantly increase shelter space now that they've announced Remain in Mexico. Last month, we know that they're planning on trying to work with the current shelters to kind of see how capacity is at the moment. But again, this just is concerning that these policies will continue to put a strain on shelters. And besides shelters, security risks for people in a lot of these cities is very, very dire. Human Rights First has documented over 8,000 violent attacks that occurred to individuals either blocked or expelled at the US-Mexico border last year. And in Tijuana, we just spoke to many people who told us how they still didn't feel quite safe in the city. They still were concerned that their persecutors would track them down. And I think another big issue that we heard again and again was just the ability to report these crimes to the Mexican authorities, because in Mexico, there is such a high level of impunity, and over a high percentage of crimes go unreported and uninvestigated. And so I think in addition to the security risks themselves, just kind of this lack of knowing where to turn to when things do happen. I think, in addition, something else we saw is just a continued struggle to access very, very basic services in these border cities. And that includes basic health services. We've spoken to pregnant women who have been turned away at Mexican hospitals, even though Mexico's law would guarantee those very basic health services for all individuals. But they've been turned away because they aren't Mexican and kind of due to discrimination. We've also heard stories of families who have been, again, forced to wait, especially with the Haitian population in communities such as Tijuana for years on end and haven't been able to enroll their children in school. Mexico's law, again, guarantees the right to education for all, regardless of immigration status, but often due to misinformation and discrimination from local school administrators, parents are turned away and told that they can't enroll their kids in school. And so again, this just adds to kind of the sense of desperation waiting in the border cities. And just finally, I think we've heard just how much in border cities also anti-Black racism and discrimination has been a major issue, and language barriers for Haitians also can be another sense of, just difficulty navigating all of these other challenges in the city. The Haitian population definitely has grown in cities like Tijuana and Mexicali since 2016, but in the past year, we've also seen kind of a growth of the population waiting in other cities. In Monterrey, for the first time, I heard from service providers there that a number of individuals were waiting there kind of either for their asylum claim to Mexico or to decide what to do in terms of the US border. And that may have included people who were kind of like expelled violently from US authorities in Del Rio. But a lot of the organizations on the ground also told us that they're now trying to look for Creole translators and to really make sure that they can support with that specific language barrier, because it is like a very new population in the city. And so I think I want to pass it over to Daniela, but this is all to say, over the past year, we have not seen the conditions in Mexican border cities improve for individuals seeking protection, for migrants, for Cubans, and for Haitians as well. And it is due again to these restrictive policies such as Title 42, such as Remain in Mexico. And moving forward in 2022, we expect the administration to continue using Title 42 to expand Remain in Mexico. And that creates real challenges for the civil society organizations that are trying to help on the ground, who haven't been given adequate resources to really meet the challenges that are ahead of them. And that also just creates all of these difficulties for those who are forced to wait, including just a lack of housing, all of these security risks, lack of access to basic services, and we're also seeing just discrimination, including anti-Black racism. And so the key to changing these conditions really is changing these policies and restoring access to asylum so that all of these individuals can walk up to an official border crossing, can walk up to a port of entry, and exercise their right, again, by US law, by international law, to seek asylum. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Savi, and thank you, Nicole and Adam. So it's a pleasure to be on a panel with such esteemed colleagues that I have the pleasure of working with really on a daily basis. And thank you, Dr. Crahan and Dr. Milanich, for the invitation. It is really a timely discussion, as many of my colleagues have already stated, just for all of us to remember the anti-asylum policies that we're still dealing with more than a year into the Biden administration. We're no longer talking about, Trump administration policies. These are policies that have really been appropriated by the Biden administration, continuing the legacy of cruelty and inhumanity from the Trump administration. And then I think particularly to discuss Haitians and Cubans and highlighting the systemic racism and discrimination that they face really along the entire migrant route, as Adam has shown us along the maps and as we've all discussed to some extent. So again, I'm with the Latin America Working Group, or LOG. For those of you who don't know us, we educate, mobilize, and advocate for more just U.S. policies towards Latin America and the Caribbean. And I have been looking at this particular issue from, the perspective not only with my colleagues, documenting the impacts of these policies on asylum seekers arriving at our border for now since the Trump administration, but in particularly really highlighting the transnational impacts of these policies and the way they also intersect with U.S. foreign policy and the regional approach that the U.S. has on migration south of our border. Because as my colleagues have already mentioned, these are policies that extend very much so beyond the U.S.-Mexico border and, have an impact not only directly in Mexico, but also in Central America and the Caribbean with the expulsion flights that we've been seeing under Title 42 to these many countries. And they also have an impact very clearly on South America. So that is kind of where I'm coming at from this discussion. And my colleagues have already covered so much that I think I'll just try to touch on a few points, kind of zooming out a little bit that maybe weren't mentioned. I wanted to start with a visit that I took to Mexico City in November of last year, where I got the opportunity to visit just a few of the migrant shelters that are in Mexico City, which, when we talk about migrant shelters, mostly they're based at the borders. So at Mexico's northern border, Mexico's southern border, there really only is about 3 migrant shelters in Mexico City. And when I went, they had just simply been overwhelmed by the arrival of Haitians. And when you mean overwhelmed, these are shelters that usually host 60 people and had, received 200 people, not just from Haiti, but the vast majority at the time were from Haiti, including families, including single adults. And yet, they were doing what they could. This has always been the attitude of shelters. And I think is kind of another overarching, point that we're all making, which is that the burden that these policies have had on civil society organizations really having to step up because the governments are not offering services to asylum seekers that are pretty much just left stranded, whether it's at the US-Mexico border or within Mexico as well. And what I saw there was, many Haitians who were waiting for their asylum applications. As Adam said, the Mexican asylum system has been broken and overwhelmed for just years, and really hasn't been able to keep a pace with the number of asylum applications, which have just hit a record number last year. And this is largely in part also due to the government's lack of prioritizing the Mexico's asylum system and not granting it the budget that it deserves to keep a pace with processing all of these applications. And yet, despite all that, the Haitians were, staying it out and wanting to wait for their asylum applications, although the delays have just been enormous. And I was just looking even today, the Mexican Refugee Agency office in Mexico City, there had been a protest by Haitians outside of that office because of the long delays and just lack of responses on their applications. So we're really looking at a broken system that has not been able to offer Haitians any sort of solution or possibility or alternative. And as I said, the shelters were really doing what they could to make the Haitians feel welcome. And in one shelter, there was the sister, Hermana Magda, had set up a cooking area for Haitians and a separate cooking area for Central Americans so that both could feel welcome. And I think these are some of the, stories that we need to uplift, which is that civil society, how civil society is welcoming populations like Haitians and Cubans, despite the racism and discrimination that they face along the entire route from government officials. And that's a different story within the migrant shelters. And so many Haitians not only are waiting for their asylum application, many, I heard the story of a young man that had come alone from Mexico's southern border just to see if he could make it to Mexico City and he had left his wife and daughter behind in Tapachula because the route was just simply too dangerous and he didn't really know what he was going to face. And then he was, thinking about bringing up his wife and daughter later on. So that visit really, to me, there were other stories of Haitians facing discrimination from the Mexican City Police and the Mexican, migration enforcement, all of these issues that my colleagues have already raised that really reflect just a very lack of solutions for Haitians in Mexico. And that to me just really reminded me, I think, too, about the way in which the U.S. government has engaged with the Mexican government on migration enforcement and on asylum. And the reality is that our border, the U.S.-Mexico border, has just been pushed further and further south, as Sabi was mentioning. U.S. pressure on other countries in the region to stop migration flows is certainly not new. We've seen it, we saw it very heavily under the Trump administration. We've seen it before under the Obama administration, in which there was pressure on the Mexican government also to step up its deportations with the arrival of unaccompanied migrant children from Central America in those years and significant funding to Mexican migration enforcement. And so what we're seeing with the Biden administration, pressuring the Mexican government behind the scenes to also take more action to step up its enforcement is not new, but it is continuing. And the Mexican government has also, as Sabi mentioned, ramped up the militarization of stopping migrants arriving at its border with really heavy-handed actions and excessive use of force through its Migration Enforcement Agency and through the National Guard. I would say that this has gone even further south. And just a couple of weeks ago, we saw a latest migrant caravan, mostly with Nicaraguans, Cubans, and Venezuelans, as well as Hondurans, being stopped in Guatemala. So I think, again, we're seeing this sort of border externalization move further south to stop migrant populations from even at this point making it to the Mexico-Guatemala border. And a lot of these migrants were just completely turned around, returned to Honduras. And, obviously this is going to happen yet again. But since, 2018, migrant caravans really haven't made it that far to begin with because of all this heavy-handed enforcement that's just continued to ramp up. And I think the other point with the caravans is of why people are being forced to migrate in caravans, again, because of the extreme insecurity risks, crime they face from migration enforcement officials, and then also just security forces, both in Guatemala and Mexico. So we're seeing a push of to, again, stop migrants increasingly further south. And this has very much impacted Cubans and very much impacted Haitians. And so sort of zooming out in terms of the US relationships with these governments on migration, the Biden administration has launched in July a collaborative migration management strategy, CMMS, that is meant to work with governments in the region on migration. In the tagline, you'll see that it's meant to work with governments in the region on, safe, orderly, fair, and humane protection for migrants. But unfortunately, what we have been seeing is cooperation on enforcement, as I've been saying, rather than collaboration on protection. And what I mean by that is, first of all, this strategy is really mainly focused at the Central American refugee population. It was intended to address migration flows specifically from Central America. And so you have, a variety of actions there working with the governments of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, with some very small initiatives potentially to provide, for example, protection to Central American migrant children, so that they're able to access protection or seek protection from their home countries, some labor programs, and working with international organizations, civil society organizations, the internally displaced. But we really haven't seen much movement on this. As I said, they're really very small programs, and they have, again, a very specific focus on Central America. And so I think what we're discussing here really points out the gaps with this strategy, is that it does not address any sort of solutions or alternatives for other populations, particularly Cubans, Haitians, also Venezuelans, which are, the numbers that we're seeing, the people that we're seeing mostly crossing from South America to the US-Mexico border that have just increased in the numbers both in Mexico and at the US-Mexico border. And so, I don't think we can say enough that there is no other way, literally, for Cubans and Haitians to seek any sort of protection besides coming to the US-Mexico border. There is no way for them to apply at a US embassy or some sort of alternative program by which they could seek, refugee status or another kind of status from a U.S. embassy in any of these countries along the route. There hasn't been an effort by the U.S. government to engage some of these other countries. We talked about Chile, we talked about Brazil, where Haitians had worked for many years and from which, Haitians are coming to the U.S.-Mexico border at this point. And instead of engaging, with some of those countries to find solutions, what we've been seeing is, an effort to actually engage with those countries to return Haitians there, because that was the last place, where they were. Which, of course, as we know, they are obviously leaving those countries for a reason, because they didn't have access to services and because they weren't able to have a dignified life there because of systemic discrimination and racism they experienced there. So there really needs to be in this collaboration on regional migration. I mean, I think there certainly is a gap, as I said, of focusing on Cubans and Haitians, but there has to be a shift from really looking more at protection options, working more with UN agencies and civil society organizations to offer protections along the route, for example. So we've heard about what happens in Panama. We've heard about what happens then at the Mexico-Guatemala border. To access, secondly, kind of access to information on what options people have along the route. And then, the ability for governments to recognize that Haitians and Cubans should be able to seek protection wherever it is that they feel safe and wherever it is that they want to have a dignified life, which in many cases, it's just not, obviously it's not Panama, it's not Chile or Brazil, won't be Guatemala, it might be Mexico. And if so, if they want to do that, then there should be the options for them to live and work there. But again, that hasn't really happened. And so there does need to be, as Nicole said, some kind of really regional conversation between the US and the other governments in the region with civil society organizations, with international organizations to find solutions. Because the policies that we're seeing now are really just exacerbating the situation. The Title 42 flights not only have been, the numbers to Haiti should really shock us all. If some of you are not aware of the numbers, I highly recommend, our colleague Tom Cartwright and the organization Witness at the Border that actually tracks these flights, and just follow them on social media or follow their website. They had just recently mentioned to us that there are now flights to Brazil, expulsion flights to Brazil. And so we are seeing a ramping up of the way in which this policy is being implemented. And just a few kind of, actions that I think we would love all of, your help on as advocates and on things that we're all pushing for at the moment. As I said, kind of, at the beginning in terms of a regional and more foreign policy approach, an approach from the U.S. that really looks at humanitarian protection in the region, not just the U.S.-Mexico border, but that doesn't externalize our own borders. So really making sure that the way in which U.S. engages with other governments in the region is to find solutions for migrants and refugees on the move and works with civil society organizations and international organizations. I think we would love your help in speaking out about Title 42. We really at a really, really difficult situation with the administration where there just hasn't been any movement, any willingness to budge on this policy. And we're unfortunately thinking that there might not be any movement in the short term this year, which is really outrageous, despite all of the impacts. And so whether, you have the possibility to go to the border, to document, to go with, Haitian Bridge Alliance and many of the other organizations along the border that are there doing this work and that are in need of volunteers. We know the pandemic poses several challenges that all of us have to face and address on our own. But if you do go, if you're able to go, write about it, share that experience with your member of Congress if you're in the United States. Share your experience with the media, share your experience with any networks that you can, because unfortunately we're seeing kind of a dwindling in media attention on Title 42, and the media attention that we are seeing is the kind of media attention that we don't necessarily want to see, with just kind of mass chaos at the border and not really pointing to any solutions or to the actually human impacts of what these policies are causing. I think there's also less talk about the flights, and so how can we talk about the transnational impacts of these policies? I would also urge you to, highlight, as we have been talking, specific impact of these policies on Haitians and Cubans and Black migrants across the board, we are all still collectively calling for an investigation into what happened in Del Rio. So that's another ask that we're actively making. The US government has not really investigated what happened at Del Rio, besides the brave efforts of Nicole and other organizations to present the lawsuit. This has not been taken up at the highest levels within the Department of Homeland Security. So that's another ask that we're making. And we certainly don't want to let that incident go into history. And like Nicole said, the U.S. government deported many of the witnesses, and it's only because of the lawsuit that we have the information of what actually happened. There have been some members of Congress, for those of us who do congressional advocacy or engaged with the Congress, there have been a few members of Congress that have spoken out about Title 42 and MPP 2.0. There's been some recent letters. But there certainly could be more. And we are just really worried that, heading particularly into the midterm elections, that many, members are maybe not so willing to speak out about this or to bring border issues to the forefront. And so there is actually an open letter right now, bicameral letter to the president on the treatment of Black migrants at the border, being led by Representatives Bush and Senator Booker and a few other senators. So that's another opportunity for those who want to get engaged. We can certainly share that information with those of you who are on the call, those who have organized the call, and if anybody wants to reach out to them, even just see if their member is on that letter, because we're really trying to make a powerful statement that something like Del Rio never happens again in terms of the U.S. government's treatments. But unfortunately, with the continuation of Title 42, we of course know that it actually may. And so we need all the support that we can get, particularly I would say reaching out to the public and the broader media about the narrative of what is happening. And I think, the fact that these policies, Title 42 and MPP, really do not represent U.S. values. They don't uphold international refugee law. They don't uphold, the U.S. obligations under international refugee law. So those are some of our, kind of asks and recommendations that we would love all of your collective help on. And obviously all of our organizations are resources in continuing to document what's happening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniela. So now we will turn to the Q&A. Please place your questions, participants, in the chat or in the Q&A rather section. And Meg, I have a question if other people don't, but I'll be quiet for a minute to see if others want to chime in. Maybe I'll go ahead and ask it if that's okay. And I encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A, or panelists, you can also ask questions of each other in the chat. Thank you so much for those wonderful presentations that all touched on very different but complementary dimensions of this issue. So I just wanted to pick up with something that several of you said and Daniela said in her comments, and that is that it strikes me the extent to which Haitian and Cuban migration really brings home the fact that this is a transnational and regional issue. We know that Central Americans also, go through Mexico or go through other Central American countries on their way to the US border, but Haitians and Cubans, we heard about Brazil, we heard Chile, Panama, Central America, et cetera, et cetera. And yet immigration law and policy is made at the level of the nation. So how do advocates and activists reconcile the national nature of immigration law and policy with the fact that we are talking ultimately about regional and transnational dynamics? Like, how do activists, should activists be organizing transnationally? Should we be relying on supranational, organizations, the, Inter-American Court? Like, where do we even start to tackle an issue? It's not enough for Biden to see the light. We need 6 other countries to also get it together. It's a very general question, but I wonder if any of you could comment on that.
I can give a very general answer, and maybe others can put more specificity on it, because if you want to talk about this being not just a series of national responses rather than an international response, we have even mentioned that the largest migrant crisis in the hemisphere is Venezuela, and the more than 5 million Venezuelans who've left their country of 30 million people since 2015, and mostly been absorbed by South American neighbors like Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile. We haven't talked about just the number of asylum seekers from Nicaragua in Costa Rica is about 120,000 since 2018. And I'm sure there's at least equivalent number that have not sought asylum who have also migrated from Nicaragua to Costa Rica. There are many Haitians in the Dominican Republic. I mean, we are in a moment of historic human mobility in the Americas that certainly demands a more regional response. And it also should be emphasized so that we hear less of this Biden's border crisis nonsense when it is actually a phenomenon that is affecting everybody for causes ranging from the pandemic to climate change to local economic collapses, some misgovernment, out of control organized crime and gang activity. Sort of this perfect storm hitting the jackpot that is showing no signs of ebbing. And while that's here, yeah, that doesn't make sense to just have individual national approaches. And I think, groups like UNHCR have been very emphatic on this and are, as we saw with the European response to the Syria crisis, multilateral responses, we have a lot of work to do.
Can I more or less add to that? Nicole and Savitri are both lawyers, practicing lawyers, and Daniela has a degree in law and diplomacy. So given that, it's quite clear that this is a regional problem. And my question is, are there any possibilities of a regional solution? You do have some organizations that deal with regional wide, Latin American wide problems from Canada all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. And there are some institutions that were created to deal with problems, legal problems in particular related to human rights. You have the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, as well as the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, both of which in recent years have been swamped with formal filings for redress for gross violations of human rights. And what would be your sense of the degree to which the Inter-American Commission, which comes into play when there is no legal redress within a country, and here we can mention Mexico and the United States, and the Inter-American Court has been adjudicating court cases that have been referred to them through the commission. Now, I know there's been a lot of historic frustration with both the commission and the court, but it seems that they have not been heavily involved in issues relating to migration. And so I would be very interested in knowing whether there are any possibilities of the commission and the court being pressured, shall we say, in a very diplomatic fashion, to deal with the problems that arise from the fact that national judicial systems are not responding to the issues that are being raised by the regional-wide, hemispheric-wide increase in migration and the treatment of migrants. So since we have three legal experts, Nicole, Savitri, and Daniela, do you have any sense, or are you just not thinking in those terms, that there are any region-wide institutions that could respond effectively?
I'm happy to start off, and then anybody else can follow. One of the things that I mentioned in my presentation was that there was a fantastic resolution that came out last fall from the Inter-American Commission on human rights. I really recommend, I'll look for it and drop a link to it so people can look at it. What it talks about is the Americas, the region, needing to respond as a whole to the crisis of Haitian migrants, to not criminalize them, to reform their systems that have anti-Black racism, to welcome them with dignity rather than criminalizing them. So I think that is a great start, and there has been quite a lot of lobbying to the Inter-American Commission, or I should say advocacy work with the Inter-American Commission, to get them to respond with this document that I think is fantastic and really a place where all countries should start. In addition to that, our organization with several organizations submitted a couple of days ago a request for a thematic hearing with the Inter-American Commission, and also the Lawyers Council for Civil Rights, I think that's what they're called. They, along with 100 organizations, filed a similar request for a thematic hearing with the Inter-American Commission this week. And both of those are asking for hearings with the whole commission to be discussing the issue of Haitian migrants. And what's really unique to these requests is generally when you are requesting a hearing or filing a request for precautionary measures or what have you, it's against one country. The system sort of started up for, I've got a problem with the United States or with Mexico and file a case against them. What we're asking for is a regional response, exactly what you're saying, Meg, right? We want a regional response. We don't want just one government there. We want all of the governments, any country where Haitians pass through, we want you all sitting at the table so that we can come together and discuss this. So it's going to be really interesting to see what the Inter-American Commission's response is to these very well-written requests for thematic hearings. Are they willing to do that? And it's something they traditionally haven't done as much, as to grant these regional requests as opposed to just one country. But the one country is a limit, because traditionally with precautionary measures and petitions on the merit that sort of start the proceedings with the commission, it is against one country. Last year, Yale Law School Human Rights Clinic, as well as Human Rights First, Center for Gender Refugee Studies, and a whole host of other organizations, including Asian Bridge Alliance, filed a request for precautionary measures with the Inter-American Commission against the United States to stop Title 42 for all the reasons that we've stated today. That is still pending, but not looking good, according to what we're saying. Nothing is official yet, but perhaps not looking good. So as you mentioned, Meg, there are a lot of limitations. Certainly there's a lot of politics involved. We also know that the United States hasn't, as you know, ratified the convention, which means that they're not bound by the Inter-American Court. So it can only rise to the level of a commission, which can issue some type of an order. But usually what would happen if a country is recalcitrant, if they're not following the order, then the Inter-American Commission has the right to kick it up and appeal it to the Inter-American Court, who then has the right to issue a judgment that should be, in most jurisdictions, binding law on that country. And many countries in the Americas, they have that system, including Haiti, but the United States government just doesn't. So that frustrates things, of course, immediately. And the Inter-American Commission can itself be a very political body. How they treat Venezuela could be very different than how they treat another country based on what the United States government thinks about Venezuela versus another country, even though the human rights violations could be similar. So agree that it can be difficult. However, certainly worth it. I think there's a lot more faith coming from, working with international human rights lawyers from Haiti. Haitian lawyers tended to have a lot more confidence in the Inter-American system. They saw that more as a body of their peers, despite the influence of the United States, given that the Inter-American Commission is seated in Washington, D.C., obviously, right? But at least the court is seated in Costa Rica. There's a perception of a little bit more independence than, for example, the United Nations, because as Adam responded to UN peacekeeping troops from Brazil, but the UN Security Council put a mission into Haiti, and that was controlled by the US government, and a whole host of international human rights violations happened by that UN peacekeeping troop over a series of many, many years. So Haiti doesn't have a lot of faith in the United Nations system, and more so in the Inter-American Commission. One of the things that I also mentioned in my presentation that I want to highlight again is that I think we do need a lot more involvement in the UN. However, when the country is being reviewed by a treaty body, for example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Conventions on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, we need to be submitting shadow reports that civil society members can do. It's a great thing for a human rights clinic or anybody to get involved in doing. Students can write these. We've written many of these with students before. We just submitted one last week for Panama's review under the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women because of the sexual and gender-based violence that I mentioned earlier. We said, come on, Panamanian government, do what you can to help stop this and to punish the abuses that are happening. You're clearly not doing enough. So we want that. We want to infiltrate these international mechanisms so that anywhere anybody looks, they see Haiti. They see, oh, we've got to deal with this Haiti migrant issue. And we want this on a holistic level, on a big scheme, so we can get to as many bodies as we can so that this issue, this crisis, is being talked about on an international level in the UN and any body that we can get them to talk about.
Thank you.
I just wanted to
I'll
interject
just quickly add that.
Sorry, that we've been joined, I believe, by the executive director of Haitian Bridge Alliance. Is that correct? Gerlaine? Joseph, I believe you're in a rectangle there. So please feel free to chime in if you're able, and if you are in fact there. Apologies, Daniela, I interrupted you. Go ahead, Daniela.
I was just going to very quickly add that some of the other requests we've made of the commission is to take trips. They often take visits to different countries or to border or regions. And so we have also made those requests to take trips to Mexico, to the US-Mexico border, to the Mexico-Guatemala border, to evidence and document everything that we've been sharing. Obviously, that requires the consent of the government. So, Nicole has mentioned some of the challenges there. Those requests are pending, and then there have been some statements that they've made, but those have, I think, often not the impact, the large impact that we would like. So there's a range of tools that we've certainly, and requests that we've made of the commission. I think often with the US, it's, how much are they really paying attention to commission, and how is the commission really forcing a change of behavior? So, but yeah, I'll go back to Gorlina if she's on, if she wants to make any comments.
My sincere apologies. I am currently driving, but I wanted to say thank you so much, everyone, for putting this together and your continued support and advocacy on behalf of those who are extremely vulnerable. We at the Haitian Bridge Alliance are looking forward to continue this journey with you. And I know for a fact that your voices make a difference. And Nicole, amazing as always. Daniela, Adam, thank you so much for lending your voices and pushing through. As we always say, Ampil Mechay Palu, merci Ampil. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Meg, do you want to take the question in the Q&A?
I didn't find any questions in the Q&A.
There's one there open. Would you like me to read it?
Can you read
Okay.
it? Because I don't find it here.
Our anonymous attendee says, you all gave an amazing talk about immigration and policies related to Haiti and Cuba and generally Central and South America. I'd love to hear you all demystify some of the social, economic, and more importantly, environmental forces or changes underlying these migrations. Adam mentioned the perfect storm. which reminds this writer of the Tropics of Chaos, where the author discusses how 21st century problems are inherited by the history of the 20th century. Go history majors, plug for history. Everything's inherited by everything that comes before, right? So thank you for this question. Also, can you all discuss some of the political economy surrounding the militarization of the border? What are the larger economic and political forces finding benefits, contractors, et cetera? So a couple of broad questions, maybe one about environmental forces in particular, and the other about the militarization of the border, I guess the US-Mexico border.
I can jump in quickly on sort of the multi-cause nature of this. Here, let me just share my screen from a different talk. Back in 2014, if you can see this graphic, UNHCR asked children who had begun arriving at the US border unaccompanied why they left home. And they ended up making this insane Venn diagram of causes, because a lot of kids gave a multiplicity of reasons. Because they were fleeing violence, because they couldn't eat at home, because they had relatives in the United States, because of domestic abuse, things like that. And that is still the case. I think you can layer on more droughts in the dry corridor, superstorms like Honduras being hit by 2 hurricanes in 2 weeks in the same exact place. The failure of crops, forcing people first to move to urban areas and then to move elsewhere in the region. And on top of that, you can layer on, I had mentioned gross misgovernment in places like Venezuela, but also in places like Honduras. It's right and left. And just a depression, a genuine economic depression brought on by the pandemic that countries haven't bounced out of yet. So I mean that it's multi-causal, and the same person will have many, many reasons for leaving, of which they might not even be able to rank them because there are so many right now. In terms of the political economy question, the militarization of the border, it is certainly an issue. I mean, there's a border security industrial complex, the same way there's a drug war industrial complex and other things. There are certain companies, certain industries, certainly in the last administration, there were cronies of the president who made a lot of money off wall construction, for instance. There are tech companies waiting to sell their facial recognition or drones or other things for the border, and they certainly help drive the policy. They're because if the border is feeling less secure, they can use that as a selling point. If the border is feeling more secure, they can say, "Hey, look, our stuff is working," and use that as a selling point. And that dynamic, we see this in so many other parts of the U.S. budget, and it's certainly it's certainly in play. It can be overstated though, because ultimately CBP's entire budget is only, I believe it's $16 billion, which sounds like a lot, but then DOD, the Defense Department is $700 billion. So it's ultimately dwarfed. It's smaller pickings compared to the defense sector, but the same dynamics are in play, just on a smaller scale.
I'm happy to speak a little bit about the climate change and sort of disasters, since that certainly has affected Haiti. As Adam mentioned, a lot of the migration started happening with Haitians after the 2010 earthquake. And as we'll remember, January 12th, 2010, there were over 200,000 Haitians that lost their lives. The government estimates over 250,000, but we really don't know. But beyond that, there were hundreds of thousands of people that were injured. There were over several 100,000 people lost their homes. People for at least a year after the earthquake, there were close to 1 million people still sleeping in internal displacement camps in the middle of the city without access to sanitation, sleeping quarters. It was very unsafe. I'm mentioning this to really give the picture of the trauma and the devastation that this natural disaster had on Haiti. But what we also like to say about that is that 7.0 earthquake that happened in Haiti, I lived through in San Francisco in 1989. And there was very little damage to San Francisco at that time. A bridge, part of a bridge collapsed, and there was some damage. We had a couple hundred people die. It was very tragic for San Francisco, but we did not have 250,000 people die. We did not lose over 200,000 homes. And the difference then is not Mother Nature and her cruelty. The difference is development. It is it's poverty. It's having building codes and access to good quality concrete and rebar to make sure that your home can withhold an earthquake and a hurricane. And so, yes, the earthquake took out Port-au-Prince and is one of the reasons that so many Haitians started to flee for Brazil in 2011 and eventually through, because when all that chaos happened, it completely toppled sort of the government, because 90% of the government buildings collapsed in the earthquake also, because it was centered in the capital. So it really undermined political stability and caused a whole sequence of what we're living now of instability. But the two really go hand in hand. And so we have to think about that. And as Haiti is supposedly the second most vulnerable country in the world to climate change, we need to be doing what we can to really shore up the country so that they are able to govern themselves in a really effective manner, so that they can make sure people have access to, the building codes, the engineers, the building supplies. What Hurricane Matthew then did in 2016 was wipe out the food systems, right? So it was, imagine if sort of all of California was affected by an earthquake, and all the trees were lost, because that's what ended up happening. It looked like a forest fire hit most of the South with the hurricane. And so the food source for most of the country was totally wiped out. And it's still, there is still problems that the trees haven't grown 5 years later to the same quantity and producing the same amount of food. People lost their livestock, everything in the earthquake, and the Hurricane Matthew. And now we've just had an earthquake again. Last year, we just had an earthquake again and aftershocks this morning, where more houses fell. I'm here with some clients and their houses just got collapsed in this earthquake today. So this is something that we're dealing with on a daily basis here. And it is Mother Nature, but more importantly, it's the destabilization that really has to be fixed. And so people see there's no opportunities, there's no way to fix it, and they feel forced to leave. And so there is for sure a direct cause in the migration.
Could I ask our panelists another question? This is an academic forum. We have many students among our listeners, surely. And I'm always struck by the difficulty in thinking through these sorts of issues, hearing from activists and advocates, realizing the dire needs for humans to step up and do something, and on the one hand, and then we have students who really want to do something, but they don't always know what to do. Several of you have mentioned concrete suggestions that students can take away from this panel, but I wonder if you might repeat them, and also, if there are specific links that you could put in the chat. Are there specific organizations that you think are doing good work and can use volunteers? Not all organizations need unskilled volunteers, but some do. Does Haitian Bridge Alliance have the capacity to put students to work for them, or other organizations or other efforts, maybe again advocacy organizations, or if you have suggestions for really specific, I'm going to log out of this Zoom and I'm going to take 10 minutes to do something for this, in response to this conversation. What would those things be? What can students do? They're sitting in their dorm room with their earphones on, watching this Zoom, or in their apartment. What's the next step that you want them to take away? Savvy, do you want to start, or Nicole? Nicole, do you want to?
Sure. Sorry, I was going to wait for you to Yeah, sure, I'm happy to. I mean, I think the easiest thing that you can start out tonight is follow all of the organizations. All of them that are on here are phenomenal organizations, like really good and I mean, the panelists speak for themselves, but I would follow all of us on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, whatever is your thing. Your generation probably doesn't Facebook anymore, but whatever is your thing that you like. Some of us are on TikTok. I don't think Haitian Bridge is, but we're definitely very active on Twitter and Instagram. So please, follow us, retweet our stuff, add to us, dialogue with us, what have you, and share that with your networks. That's a really good way. And just get incensed, learn more about the issue. I mean, I have to say that you're at such a beautiful, fertile time in choosing your career and what you want to do. And do you want to do this kind of work, whatever this means, full time? Do you want to do it part time? How do you want to do it? And so get more involved. If this is something that interests you, get involved as a student and however you can and learn more and see how that might direct your career. We are always looking for volunteers. In particular, we look for folks who have Haitian Creole speaking skills are really important to us, as well as any sort of African language dialects. Those are always really important to us too. So, we definitely encourage those folks in particular to volunteer. And I'm just nphillips at haitianbridge.org. So I'm pretty easy to get in touch with. If you do want to volunteer, we accept volunteers, other types of volunteers too, but in particular language speakers, we love.
One quick suggestion. I was just looking, I mean, I'm on a bunch of calls and working groups and stuff of groups that are doing this good work. None of them seem to have like a permanent presence. It's always sort of ad hoc and we get together. But one thing you can do is search Google for words like NGO asylum letter or border rights letter. And you'll find some recently signed letters by groups of NGOs, often dozens. And see who the signers are and track some of them down, look them up on the web and see if their work overlaps with your interests. And also think local. Almost every community in the United States is receiving a lot of asylum seekers and other migrants who may need support, and they just may need people, everything from gathering clothes to helping with forms to, if you're near the border, helping people get through the airport or the bus station. There are a lot of basic needs for labor. So look into what is happening just in your community too.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
I was
I'll
just
also
gonna mention. Go ahead, Savi.
Yeah, no worries. I was just going to mention that definitely volunteer in your local community. I was also trying to find information in my email because I do think there might be some court observation in Remain in Mexico, but I'm not sure that I have the contact for that yet. But that would definitely be a volunteer opportunity really related to what we've all talked about. I think the final thing is also just think about if there are any research opportunities on the issues that we've been discussing. I actually have a background in research and started doing this research on the conditions for asylum seekers at the US-Mexico border as a graduate student at UC San Diego. And that led me to a career in advocacy. And through that research, I was able to support litigation, to support the work of advocates. So there really is, I think, a really important role also for research, and just wanted to make sure to give a shout out to that.
Yeah, I would just echo the, if you can't make it to the border, if the pandemic, you don't feel comfortable going there or doing those kinds of trips, that to really do look in your community. Also, if you are, you practice a religion or you have a faith-based community, churches are often really great places also that are already doing this kind of work and are an easy way to get involved. LOG works with a lot of faith-based organizations that are very active. They have shelters on the border, or they're in local communities, really serving as the only sort of welcoming places to many asylum seekers and migrants in many cases. So check those out or ask in your local church. And if not, maybe you can be the one to start that work. I posted all of our websites in the chat. LOG also does the migration news brief every week, that's weekly, that you can sign up for, where we actually cover all of these what's going on in terms of regionally from the US to Mexico to Central America, and a lot of the issues that we've talked about that you can sign up to receive, and then you just get in your inbox, and it's a great way to stay on top of the news. I also want to highlight Adam's great weekly border news blog. I think it's called a blog, but it's much more than that. It's also kind of a roundup of information, documents, and you were impressed by his slideshow, which you should have been. That's also a great way to just also get it in your inbox. So you should definitely sign up for that. And if there's a direct link, Adam, you should definitely mention that. And then in terms of the congressional advocacy, if you do have the capacity to, or are interested in that, there are many organizations, all of ours also, that are staying on top of opportunities where there are letters, where you can contact your member of Congress or tweet at them or something like that. That maybe you want to pool your clubs or organizations at the local school and do a joint action or do a joint letter, or do take an action towards your member, your representative at home. And we really couldn't echo enough, I'm sure many of you know, the power that constituents have. Many of us are organizations, kind of the typical organizations that congressional offices hear from, but just congressional, constituents really do have a power in raising this. And sometimes, when it's not a border state, it's not an issue that rises to the front, but if it's something you care about and your member isn't taking an action on it, you should be raising it with them.
Nara?
I was
think-
going to see if anybody else had anything else to say, because I don't, but those are super helpful. I just also wanted to tell the audience that a shout out to the Center for Mexico and Central America. We are funding a series of applied academic projects where we pair with advocacy organizations or academics doing applied work. A couple of those projects actually have to do with migration specifically, and we welcome students becoming involved in those projects. We hire students as assistants, and we're always also, for folks on the panel, looking for partner organizations who are interested in, it could be student assistance, or it might be other kinds of resources that the university has access to. So for example, we've watched the digital humanities expert at the library pair with activist organizations on a database, for example. So this might be about student assistance, but it might be about other kinds of resources that the university tries to put at the disposal of activist and advocacy organizations like yours. So we're always looking for those kinds of collaborations.
And if I could add, as the co-sponsor of this webinar, the Cuba program will be posting in about 10 days the videotape of this webinar, and it will also be posted on YouTube. So if you wanted on your campus to show it to a student organization or even just your friends, you'll be able to do that, and you can pass the word, and you'll find many mentions of organizations working on migrations and migrants.
And perhaps the administrator of the Zoom can save the chat, and we can pick out the names of the organizations that have been dropped in the chat and publish them alongside the recording of this session.
Right. Ellen?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay. All right.
Meg, do you have any final comment that you want to make, or anybody else on the panel?
No, essentially, we've reached the limit of our time. We're confined by the fact that there is only one Zoom portal at the Institute of Latin American Studies, and there's generally a waiting list to use it. But I do want to thank our panelists who've been exceptionally generous with their time and their expertise. It's one of the best webinars we've had, and I particularly want to thank Nara and the Center for Mexico and Central America for co-sponsoring this, and I look forward to working with all of you again in the future.